Welcome to House 333. This living room is really the heart of the home, bright and inviting, and directly over the burial ground.
What was that?
I said, lots of room to play around. Let's go check out the kitchen.
All right.
Here we have a state-of-the-art kitchen, modern appliances, granite countertops, where the original owner was found dead.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
I said these countertops could make anyone drop dead.
Pretty sure you said something else.
Don't be silly. Ghosts aren't real.
No one mentioned ghosts.
Quickly, before sundown. This master suite is an absolute dream. Wide windows, a walk-in closet. Large enough to hang yourself in.
Okay, you're clearly saying things under your breath, thinking that I can't hear you.
Haunted? Goodness no! Don't be silly!
No one said haunted.
Oh, I see. A shrewd bargainer. Okay then, I'll give it to you for free.
What? For free? But...
Wow, you really talked me down. Just sign right here, please.
But...
Just sign on the fucking line!
Okay,
Thank you. Enjoy your new burial plot. Beautiful lot. Bye-bye. It's yours now, asshole.
Well, that was weird.
Who dares enter my home?
Okay. That definitely wasn't the wind.
Sorry, forgot to give you the spare key. All right. F*** you.
No, come on.
Sorry, forgot my Chipotle. Well, f*** you, I guess.
Well, I guess the only right thing to do is bring a wife and children into this place.
Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
And I'm Gage Hurley.
And you have arrived, oh my God, at the blessed street that we all know and love, the Creep Street Podcast. Now, of course, follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Creep Street Podcast, X at Creep Street Pod. We're also on TikTok. And of course, if our sort of weekly/bi-weekly schedule is not enough for you, and believe me, for most people, it's not. It's not, Gage. It's like a drug.
It is.
They just want it right in their veins. You know what I mean?
And once you've tasted it, you just can't get enough.
That's right. Tie that belt off. Pull tight. Stick that needle in and get yourself some Patreon content over at www.patreon.com/CreepStreetPodcast. Now, folks, we're kind of getting back to our roots here on Creep Street with this one. We are doing a good old-fashioned haunting. We're getting on that boat. We're headed on over to jolly old England. Because today's story is the haunting of House 333. Yes. Let me haunt you with my sources real quick. First, it was a book called The Lady in the Bay Window, The True Story of a Haunted Sheffield Home by William C. Grave. Just so everyone knows, this is William's personal account of this haunting. But he did use a pen name, and I think almost all the names in it aren't, they aren't the original names of the people, so just take that. Then we have an article from Mysterious Universe called Number 333, A Terrifying 20-Year Haunting in a Typical English Suburban House by Mark Louth. And also a podcast interview I found online with William C. Grave. The name of the interview is The Lady in the Bay Window, and you can find it at the YouTube channel DJ Jet's Multimedia Interviews. So, let's dive into this. So, we're going back. Today's tale is, as I said, it's focused on this house in Sheffield, numbered 333, a semi-detached house tucked away there in Sheffield in South Yorkshire, England. And this house is where William C. Grave found himself in the middle of some of the most terrifying and hair-raising paranormal activity ever put on record. After moving in during the mid-2000s, Grave would experience events so chilling that they would make even the bravest of us run screaming. He documented it all in his book, The Lady in the Bay Window, a true story of a haunted Sheffield home. And let us tell you, folks, this isn't just a tale about things going bump in the night. This is something that, as far as we know, is still going on. So William C. Grave, at the time when this house came into his life, he was just 19 years old and he was still living at home with his parents there in Sheffield, and life was comfortable and cozy. And William, he saved up a decent chunk of change working as a car salesman, and things were looking pretty sweet for young William. But as fate would have it, love and maybe a little ambition had other plans for the young man. He and his fiancée decided it was time to fly the nest, find a place of their own, lay down some roots, as they say, lay down some roots. Towards the end of the year, the two of them started hunting for the perfect house, scoping out properties all over Sheffield, and that's when they stumbled across what seemed like an ordinary semi-detached house in the south of the city near Charnock. They loved it the moment they laid eyes on it, so they quickly scheduled a viewing to see the place. William was just too eager to get a sneak peek at this place, so the day before their official viewing, William stops by for a gander. Now, in his book, The Lady in the Bay Window, he describes the house as being perched high on a road, with dark, weathered bricks that kind of gave the place an aged look and sort of an out-of-time feel, like it didn't really fit any sort of time era or something. It was something out of time, and I think we all kind of know, we can all envision what that means. I think we all have seen something that kind of seems out of time, or even sounds out of time. I think a lot of times certain songs, great songs, I know this is kind of a rant, but certain songs, it's like they could have almost been released in any decade and they would still be a hit because they just have a sound that's
yes,
it's just kind of its own thing. And I think that's kind of the feeling they got. There was something about it. It was just the house of their dreams and they wanted it. And then there were the bay windows. Two of them, one stacked above the other, gazing out over an overgrown front yard that seemed more like a wild bramble than a yard. Yet despite the rugged appearance, William was really falling in love with the place and the prospect of, starting a new life with his fiancée. I mean, you're 19, you're living at home, you're ready to get out there. I remember at 19, you get out there, you get crazy.
You do.
You do.
You're an animal.
I mean, what are you going to do? What's a 19-year-old going to do? What's he going to do, huh? He wants a place to himself where he can play Baldur's Gate 3, which is probably what I'm going to do after this. Just saying. Half-elf ranger class. And that's what he wants. He wants the freedom to play Baldur's Gate 3. So let's continue. When he and his fiancée toured the place, they're smitten by it. And they wasted no time making an offer, which, the seller quickly accepted. And I think part of it, too, like I said, it's, you're young and almost sometimes the first place you see, even if it isn't the best, it's just you're so eager to, to start your own life and stuff that anything seems promising, of course. In a few weeks, once the keys were in hand, the place would officially be theirs. But little did they know that this was not just a house. Oh, no. This house was something else entirely. Those weathered bricks and bay windows were more than just features. In many ways, they were a gateway, as if they were the very eyes and flesh of the house. So it's a cold December night. William is just weeks away from officially moving into his newly purchased home. On this particular night, William was on his way to a Christmas party with his pal Craig, and now William could not resist the urge to show off his big purchase to his buddy Craig. So the two decided to take a quick detour and swing by the property for a, quick little gander. So they pulled up outside, staying cozy in the car, of course. Craig, he leans out the window. He's trying to get a better look, and he says, "Wow, man, this is a lovely place." But then he said something else. He said, "Who's the old lady in the bay window?" Well, William's stomach kind of twisted a little bit, as you might expect, because there's not supposed to be anybody in there. He snaps his gaze towards the house and scanning the windows for any sign of anyone, and he doesn't see anything. William sees no one. So naturally, he's confused, and he asks Craig what's he talking about, and Craig just deliberately points directly to the upper bay window and is like, there. The old lady staring down at us. Not just old lady, an old lady staring down at us. No matter how hard William looked, there's no one in that window, at least for his eyes. Just empty panes of glass. Yet Craig was adamant he could see this old woman. So here we already have something kind of interesting. This being chooses to appear to the guy who's not moving in, which is kind of interesting. William is not seeing it, yet his pal is. It's kind of interesting to think about and remember as we move forward. So after Craig insists that he can see this elderly woman glaring down at them, William naturally is feeling a little uneasy, and just to be sure there wasn't some mistake, William double-checked with Craig, making sure, you are looking at house number 333, right? You're not pointing to the, it's a semi-detached house, so there's other houses right near it. He's like, maybe he's looking at some other house. But no, Craig is like, man, I'm looking at your place, dude. And there's an old lady up there, just hanging out in the bay window. And Craig is literally like, how can you not see her? It's obvious. It's not like she's peeking out the thing. No, she's like standing there looking down at him. And he said that specifically, which was kind of unnerving, was that this woman's gaze was specifically angry looking. Like it was looking down at them like a couple of young punks loitering or something. That's weird. So already Craig is getting this, the guy that's not even living there is getting this feeling from this, we assume this spectral entity he's seeing, that they are not wanted and to not even think about coming inside. So William did his best to dismiss it, and he just tried to tell himself Craig was just, maybe this was a long form prank. Maybe maybe he'd keep it going for a few days, but then eventually tell him that, we're just busting your balls. But no.
Surely.
Yeah, no. Balls will not be busted. Unfortunately, this is the one case where you would want balls busted. But these balls stay whole through the whole thing. Balls. So a week later, William and his fiancée, they finally get their hands on the keys to their new dream home, and the date is precisely December 18th, 2004. So what are we talking? We're talking American Idiot. I would have been either depending on if it's December, I would have been a sophomore in high school. So that's where we're starting off. Dylan's sophomore year. So the house itself already had a bit of a backstory. The previous owner, a guy named Nick, had apparently bought the place for his elderly mother. But here's the kicker. She lasted just 2 months in that house before getting out. No reason was given why she wanted to leave, but William, of course, at the time, didn't think much of it. Just chalking it up to, personal preferences. Maybe, she's an older lady. Maybe she There's certain ways she likes things, and who knows? And plus, like I said, it's your first house. He's just eager to start a new life with his fiancée. So,
first house, he'll take almost anything.
yeah, he'll take it. He'll take it, folks.
I'll take a cardboard box.
I'll take it.
It's
You
free.
know what I'm saying? Come on. It's like San Francisco. But looking back, of course, he realizes he's got a pretty good idea nowadays why that elderly woman wanted out of there so bad. So, excited to get inside and become the official owner of the place, William and his lady approached the front door. And before they could even turn the key for the first time, they heard what sounded like voices coming from inside the house. Surely this was just, maybe it was an echo coming from another house, and it just kind of sounded like it was coming from inside their house. Surely there's not people in there. Well, he opens the door, and sure enough, standing in the entryway is a large, bald-headed man who introduced himself as Nick, the previous owner. Nick offered a hearty handshake, but there was something about this encounter that just kind of felt off. Nick explained that he had come back to retrieve a bag of tools that he had left behind, and fair enough, right? You might forget something when you're moving out, but then in walks an elderly woman who introduces herself as Nick's mom. And this is where things start to get really weird. So this is the lady who didn't last barely 2 months, right? Nick's mom casually mentions that it was about 6 months ago that she moved out of the house after Nick had bought it at a property auction. She added that the house had originally been owned by an old lady who had lived there since the 1930s when it was a council house. She also dropped this ominous little tidbit, quote, "Something in the house just wasn't right." But before William could dig for more details, Nick stepped in. And just like that, they were gone, leaving William alone in the house for the first time. You can almost imagine Nick's mom being like, there's something strange about, okay, Mom, we gotta go. Okay, let's go. Come on. Because Nick's probably like, he doesn't want this sale to fall through, right? So he's like, come on, Mama, let's get in the car and let's get going. Now, you'd think that this would set off some alarm bells for William, but no. He brushed it off, chalking it up to just, idle chatter. But also at the same time, obviously knowing that this is going to be a scary story, as people listening to this from a third-person perspective, of course, our natural thought is like, oh, get out of there, man. But think about it. When you've saved up all that money, and you think about the money, especially nowadays, but buying a house, like, especially if it's something like a haunting, what are you going to do? Just back out now? You've got so much sunk into the place that you kind of like, unless you got the money to do it, you got to go with the flow. So that's why I always try to be understanding when people are like, get out now. Sometimes, yes, especially if you are starting to get physically harmed, or your children or your animals or something. But in this case, what's Nick going to do? Even if she's like, yeah, there's a ghost there. Well, I just sank however many thousands into this place. I can't just he's 19 years old. I can't imagine he's got tons of money.
And like you said, from the third person, it's easy to say, look at all the signs. But we know we're going through a scary story here. This guy is probably a bit skeptical at this point. Obviously, like you said, he's got a lot invested in it. So it's going to take a lot.
Absolutely.
For him to actually say, let's move out of this house.
Absolutely. You kind of don't have a choice but to brush it off, because until a literal, demon is grabbing you by the throat, yeah, you got to kind of make do.
Even then, I'm a little cheap, so I'm like, I might live with the demon.
If it's paying rent, it
could at least help with the electric bill.
Yes, at least help with the utilities, or do the dishes every now and then, for Christ's sake.
Yeah, come on, pull your weight.
Come on, yeah. So it's William's first night in his new home, house number 333. And his fiancée at this time, she's still at her parents'. So he decided to make the best of it. He invited over 5 of his closest pals, and they had a little, unofficial housewarming party. They had some beers and sleeping bags and played a good old classic game of Monopoly. Oh, man. Whoo! Boys will be boys, you know what I'm saying? A lot of testosterone at Park Place. A couple hours into their night of fun, their little housewarming shindig, the group is laughing and strategizing over hotels and get-out-of-jail-free cards, when suddenly one of William's friends, Greg, suddenly screams. And we're talking a blood-curdling scream. Without word or explanation, he bolts across the room. And of course, chaos kind of erupts because everyone's like, what the? I mean, if all of a sudden, and we're talking a blood-curdling scream, everyone's kind of up on their feet like, what the fuck's going on? What's happening? Drinks are spilled, game board pieces are scattered everywhere. Everyone's just kind of standing there frozen, looking at Greg like, what's going on? Greg came to a stop at the far side of the room, and his eyes were wide with fear. He's looking at something no one else can see but him. What was he staring at? William thought maybe it was the Christmas tree in the corner, something about that spooked him. But Greg was absolutely petrified. That it wasn't like he saw something that startled him, and then he realized, it was just the coat rack. No, Greg is still actively looking at something and has a look of dread in his eyes. Slowly, William approaches his friend Greg and says, he's like, hey, buddy, it's all right. It's all right, because they can tell this isn't a prank. They can tell something. And so he's being very calm, he's like, hey, buddy, come with me to the kitchen. Let's sit. Let's relax a second. So they go, and he sits down in the kitchen with Greg, and Greg is literally trembling, still trembling. And he finally speaks. And Greg says, did you not see her? I mean, his voice is barely a whisper. He says, an old lady sitting on an invisible chair next to the Christmas tree, just staring at me, hovering on nothing. So think about that. It's, once again, if you're William, you're starting to notice a pattern. An old gal who doesn't seem too happy that you're there. And once again, William can't see her. The guy who owns the place can't see her. And, obviously for added effect, she's floating above the ground. She likes theatrics. She must have done theater in her day. Who knows?
And only Craig and Greg can see her. So...
Well, I mean, first it was Craig, then Greg. They called up their friend Meg. They ordered a keg and some chicken legs. It was a good night. But until this moment, of course. So William hears Greg say this. Of course, his blood runs cold, because he could tell right away this isn't a prank. And the way the other guys were acting, they're freaked out by Greg's behavior. So clearly this was not a prank. So who or what was this old lady? And why did she choose, of all moments, that moment to show herself? So William keeps asking Greg questions because he wants more details about this old lady. And remember Craig's earlier sighting, it was the old lady in the bay window. All of a sudden that comes flashing back into William's mind because he's like, oh crap. Now I've got a second person seeing an old geezer in my house.
It definitely sounds like a possessive kind of haunting.
It kind of does.
Not wanting them there.
So William presses Greg for more details, right? He wants to know who this old gal is this old geriatric not paying rent and giving them mean glances all the time.
Angry freeloader. Who wants that in their house?
At least be grateful. So, of course, when he's hearing this, suddenly he's remembering what his other friend said, Craig, about seeing an old woman, and he's like, oh, shit, things are starting to add up. Greg began to describe her. He described her as, quote, probably in her 80s or 90s, with short, curly gray hair, a long skirt, a white blouse, and a dark cardigan. Sounds a little bit like my grandmother in a way. So William feels this pit in his stomach as he's hearing this, and Greg says she was staring right at me. And he's telling them this like, his voice is shaking. So William's heart is racing, but, he tried to keep his concerns to himself. He didn't want to escalate any tensions, especially right before his fiancée is about to move in. He doesn't want to scare her off. So somehow he managed to convince Greg to stay that night, and the group returned to the living room, and the rest of the evening actually passed without incident. But William could not shake the feeling that there was someone in the house that shouldn't be. I mean, imagine staying after that. Like, I don't think I would even go to the bathroom alone. I think I would even have someone come to me to the bathroom. Or, like, how do you convince your friend to stay? Because either that or the friend's wondering, like, am I literally losing my mind?
Maybe just my friends are having psychotic breaks around the same time?
Yeah, maybe.
Be a weird coincidence, but...
Maybe. I mean, hey. So the new year rolls in, and it's 2005, baby. And William felt a sense of relief. Now his fiancée is officially moved in. The house is starting to really feel like a home for the first time. And thankfully, the eerie events that came before their final move-in had seemed to have died down. But even still, William obviously could not ignore the questions that lingered in his mind. A chance conversation with their neighbor, a guy named Teza, he lived about 2 doors down. Well, he brought some intriguing clues to the mix. Teza explained that the original owner of this place was a lady named Mrs. Tompkins, and she had been a longtime resident living there since the place was built as a council house in the 30s. She was known around the neighborhood for her meticulous care of her home, especially her windows, which she insisted on keeping sparkling clean. So you can start to get a picture why maybe there's this anger. Maybe it's not so much a sinister, like, I gonna kill you, but maybe it's like, you better not scuff up my windows.
You better take your shoes off.
Exactly. Exactly. You better wipe your feet, young man. Well, Teza hadn't experienced anything personal since Mrs. Tompkins passed several years earlier, but William was realizing that if there was truly a presence in the house, that Mrs. Tompkins was probably the person. By the summer of 2005, life took another turn for William. He and his fiancée broke up, and William found himself once again the sole owner and occupant of House 333. The only living occupant, that is. With 2 spare bedrooms sitting there empty, he decided he needed to bring folks in, to help him pay the bills. I'm sure if you're owning a frickin' house with no one else and it's got like 3 or 4 bedrooms, I'm sure that's a pretty penny. So his first choice was a no-brainer. One of his best pals since childhood, a guy named Doug. They were very close, great friends. Doug took the second largest room, overlooking the rear garden. As the two hashed out the details, William casually mentioned that there was a third smaller bedroom at the front of the house and asked his pal Doug if he knew anyone who might be interested. And Doug immediately knew someone, another friend named Dan. So Dan and Doug, let's try to keep these two. We've got Craig, Greg, Dan, and Doug. You could tell that these were names he gave them, that these weren't like real, you know what I mean?
Yeah. These are probably all fake names.
So Dan wasted no time checking the place out, and he was very enthusiastic to to join him, so he took the third bedroom. And, William, even though it sucks he had to break up with his fiancée, he's got a renewed sense of self. He's with his boys. It's going to be booze and Monopoly every night. You know what I'm saying?
Good times.
It's good times with his bros. Well, at first, William kept the eerie stories and all the strange events to himself. He didn't want to spook away his friends, especially because he needed people living there. However, as time passed and the trio grew, closer and more comfortable living together, William decided to finally fess up one night over some beers about all the strange things that had been going on. He recounted the unsettling events, the strange sightings and noises, and to his surprise, Doug and Dan were actually captivated by the tales and weren't freaked out at all. For them, it was kind of like, kind of fun. It was an added bonus. A ghost bonus.
Ghost bonus.
It was a ghost bonus. As the stories unfolded, Doug suggested something that William had not considered before, but what if they went and checked out the loft, the attic, upstairs? Dan asked William, have you been up there yet? And, maybe there's something, maybe we can find some answers up there to what's causing all this spooky stuff. Doug is, kind of half joking, but he's also very intrigued by the prospect of, living with an actual ghost. And it hit William that despite living in the house for months, he'd actually never gone to the attic. So at around 10 p.m. that night, the gents worked up the nerve to go have a look at the loft. So the three of them made their way upstairs, and once at the loft entrance, William and Dan, they hoisted Doug up into the loft, allowing him to peer around in the darkness, and all he had was his mobile phone to use as light, and we're talking a 2005 mobile phone. He's probably got a BlackBerry.
He was probably one of those guys.
Probably had a little pen he pulled out and wrote notes.
Probably had a Bluetooth headset.
Yeah, I bet he was talking to the guy. I bet they were like, Doug, we're right below you. And he's like, hold on, I'm not getting a good signal. So Doug, he's got his phone and he's, it's doing little to light the space, just very dimly. And a moment later, he lets out a sharp gasp and jerks back in fright. His phone falls from his hand, and he quickly lowers himself back down to the floor. He pretty much just hops out of that loft with a loud thud. For a moment, Dan and William are just staring at Doug as he's catching his breath. They're waiting to hear, like, what got you? What happened up there? He hesitated, catching his breath, before finally blurting out, "It's empty up there, except for a single wooden stool in the middle of the room." So think about that. While he hadn't seen the ghost of an old lady, there was something about the sight of that solitary chair. It just stood there alone. It wasn't like with other stuff, pushed in a corner. It was like it had been deliberately and probably recently set there. It reminds me of the Terror in the Berkshires episode we did with just the random staircases in the middle of the woods. It's like, why is this stool? I can understand not a ghost, why that would freak the shit out of you.
Yeah, it just seems like somebody's using it. It seems like it's placed there because it's been recently used.
Right. It was deliberate. It wasn't just storage. It wasn't just it. This was deliberate. Despite his unease, Doug was determined to confront whatever it was that had unsettled him so badly. And after regaining his composure, he climbed back up into the loft and even worked up the gumption to sit his ass cheeks down on that stool. That's a bold son of a bitch, if you ask me.
That sure is.
Whoo! Ho, ho, ho. Man.
Up in a squat.
Oh, man.
Taking a load off.
That's right. Right on the ghost stool. It's a spectral stool sample. Using his phone, he recorded several minutes of footage. And his friends, waited downstairs for him. And, he isn't filming anything in particular, just kind of filming around the room to think maybe later when we observe it, maybe we'll see something. So after the investigation in the loft, the three friends, they return to the living room, and the conversation, of course, is buzzing, and they're all speculating what's going on. Why was this lone wooden stool just sitting there? Who put it there and why? They played back the footage that Doug had captured on his phone, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Several weeks go by, and a mutual friend of theirs visits the house and eagerly asks to watch the video they took. And after studying the footage closely, the friend pointed out something that none of them had noticed before. Strange, faint orbs of light drifting across the loft. Now, we know that there's many things that can cause this. Flecks of dust. Bugs, of course, can sometimes look like orbs when they're captured on camera, but sometimes they're just real goddamn orbs. Not everything's got to be dust or bugs. Sometimes, maybe it's a goddamn orb. The friend explained that orbs like these were often believed to be signs of spirits or spectral presences that might be lingering nearby. Oftentimes, it's believed that when you are seeing an orb, that it is a spirit attempting to manifest, attempting to take form. It's trying to work up the energy to take form. I mean, who knows what? But from a lot of our stories, it seems like sometimes, it really takes a lot of energy to manifest. A lot of times magnetic things like compasses will go haywire. This is totally a side note, but sometimes it seems like there might even be some sort of an electromagnetic phenomenon associated with the manifestation of these spirits. Well, the eerie activity in the house did not let up. And over the next few years, things would escalate. William and his roommates, Doug and Dan, frequently reported what they called heavy footsteps that would echo through the house. Often from rooms that they knew for a fact were empty, that no one was in. On more than one occasion, they even caught glimpses of shadowy figures lurking just on the edge of their vision, right in their periphery, which, as we know, shadow people are wont to do. What's more chilling, though, is William claimed that nearly every visitor who stepped foot in this house had their own unnerving encounter with something paranormal. But as far as I know, other than the stool and stuff, and the footsteps and everything, William's kind of getting blue-balled here. He's the only one who hasn't seen this ghost. They're going to have to call him Blue Balls Billy.
I'd be kind of offended at this point if I was William.
Yeah, because you'd start to think, well, what is it about me? But honestly, though, from a real standpoint, let's say you're in that position. You're in a haunted place. Everyone can see it, but part of me wonders, well, maybe is it because it's not because it's ignoring you? Maybe it's because you're the one it prefers, or who knows? Like it's trying to scare off other people.
True. Maybe it's you're the one it has no problem with.
Well, think about it like this. Oftentimes, it's theorized that these entities feed off of negative energy. And we know, it doesn't go into specifics, but we know that William and his fiancée broke up. I'm sure the house leading up to that breakup was filled with tension and made arguments, and it's almost like, theoretically, a buffet for spectral presences, especially negative ones, shadow people and whatnot that might be feeding off of that negative energy.
Yum, yum. Fuck you, bitch. Oh, that's tasty.
Going back for seconds like it's a golden corral.
You never loved me. Ooh, that's tasty.
That is tasty. You never listen to my needs. I'll take another helping of that. During this period, old Willie, he's working, 70, 80 hours a week. He's really putting in the hours. That, of course, made his weekends sort of a precious oasis where he could kind of unwind and do his thing, recharge, you know. He and his boys, they would typically unwind with some beers and takeout, and, of course, board games, things like that. But one particular weekend was destined to be a little bit different. A night where the strange phenomenon in the house seemed to ramp up in a way that none of them could have anticipated. It was a lively Saturday night at House 333, and the housemates William, Doug, and Dan, they were joined by their friends, Ben and Brad, and the affectionately nicknamed Bungle. So spirits were high as the group prepared for the big Manchester Derby, the big match between Manchester United and Manchester City. Kickoff was at 5:30 p.m. and the beers flowed freely, just like the Spice Malone. And they laughed and joked and waited for the match to begin. By the time Bungle arrived later that evening, the living room was a-buzzing with energy. And I'm sure the folks were buzzed as well.
I would think so. I would hope so.
Oh, I would hope so. You would think, from what I understand, those European football matches, man, they really go all out. The gang is fully engrossed in the match, cheering, chattering, and talking. But as the excitement of the game carried on, there was an unsettling shift in the atmosphere of the house. As William and two of his friends sat comfortably on the settee, which I think is like a couch, I'm pretty sure. So the boys, they're all sitting on the couch, when suddenly on William's side, because William's sitting at one end, the couch lifts off the ground, as if someone hoisted it up. Not the whole couch, but as if someone grabbed the side of it and picked it up so it's tilted. And then this lift, it was not like done gradually. It was a sudden, deliberate, intentional movement. And for several tense moments, the couch remained cocked up on its side. And then, after a moment, bang, it just drops to the ground, like whoever was holding it just dropped it hard to the floor. The boys sit there in stunned silence, the eerie hum of the football match playing in the background. For a moment, none of the men spoke, their eyes darting between one another, searching for answers, hoping one of them had some kind of an explanation. Finally, William broke the silence, saying, "What the hell was that?" Also breaking the silence was Brad, sitting on the other side of the couch, nervously spoke up, saying, "I saw what happened." His voice was shaking. He said the couch lifted at least 5 inches in the air at one side and then just fell back to the floor. Now, the details of his account sent another wave of unease through everyone. Without much more to say, he excused himself and left the house. He had had enough of House 333 for that evening, so it was enough that he left the match. He didn't even stay to watch the match. He wanted to go home. The remaining friends stayed, but of course the atmosphere was dampened by what had happened. They had no idea, though, what would be coming next. By early 2008, the dynamics at number 333 had shifted once again, with Doug and Dan having both moved out, William once again the sole owner of the house. The solitude came with, of course, financial burden, and now William, of course, solely responsible for payments of utilities and whatnot. He starts looking around for people to fill those spare rooms. But coincidentally, William's brother Darren had recently gotten engaged and was living with his fiancée. They were in a small apartment behind their parents' home, and Darren proposed a solution. William could move into their apartment temporarily, while Darren and his fiancée lived over at House 333 until their wedding. Afterward, Darren and his fiancée would move back into their house, and that would, give William, too, also time to find roommates for when he went back to House 333. It was an offer that William really didn't have a choice but to go with because financially it was really his only option. It was kind of a blessing. It was just so happened that his brother and fiancée had a place that was much cheaper that he could use. However, surprise, surprise, it wasn't all smooth sailing for Darren and his fiancée when they moved into House 333. Almost immediately, they began to experience unexplained, eerie activity, the same that had plagued William and his friends. As the winter of 2008 rolled in, William found himself back at the house at 333, with Darren and his new wife now settled back in their own home. So William moves back in, and as soon as he crosses the threshold of the door, he felt what he described as an immediate, oppressive unease wash over him. You see, he had been away, and I'm sure felt, you know what, it'll be different this time. I'm older. I'm wiser. Even seeing the place, he felt fine. But the second he crossed the threshold, he knew the house was back to its old tricks. So at this point, it's worth mentioning that tragedy had struck several months earlier. You see, in May, William's former housemate, Dan, had passed away unexpectedly. Now, the book does not give specifics on how he died, but with this oppressive presence weighing on them heavily that night, William is feeling compelled to, confront whatever it is that might be essentially torturing them at this point. So he just spoke out loud into what was seemingly an empty room, and he says, "I can feel you here in with me. Is that you, Dan? Or some other spirit in the house with me?" Well, no response came. So he picked up his mobile phone and decided to capture the space in front of him, urging whatever might be there to show itself. Unsatisfied, William turned slightly to face the television, which sat switched off and dark, and snapped another picture. Moments later, as he's reviewing the images on his phone, his blood runs cold. The first photo revealed nothing unusual, but the second photo left him stunned. As William reviewed this photograph, his eyes were drawn to his own reflection, inadvertently captured in the darkened television screen. So curious, he kind of zoomed in on it on his phone, and with each swipe, the closer it gets in, the more detail becomes clear. And that is when he saw it. Looming behind him, unmistakable, was a dark, shadowy figure. And boy, it was not Dan. Of that, William was certain. You see, Dan was tall, lean. This figure was massive, towering over William where he sat on the sofa. He described this being as sort of a bulky-looking guy with no discernible features, just a dense black mass that just radiated this oppressive presence. Now, it kind of makes me think of Signs a little bit, even though that was a different scenario. But remember, near the end, he adjusts the TV, and in the reflection of the TV, you see the alien. It kind of reminds me of that, or like in Insidious, whenever they look at old photos of Josh when he's little, and you can see the old lady getting ever closer to him like that.
It also makes me think of some scenes from The Babadook.
Absolutely right, actually. You're absolutely right. Yeah, it lends itself to that vein, especially if you're dealing with the subject of grief. If he's grieving, his friend Dan, because Babadook in many ways is a study on grief and its effects. I mean, yeah, in a way it does kind of harken that essence for sure. So, of course, William's about ready to shit his pants. So he gets up and he runs right out of the house without a second thought, rushing right to his parents' home. And there he stayed for several hours, just kind of getting his wits about him, collecting himself. Tragically, several weeks later, though, and this is a super bummer. It's obviously not tragic like losing your friend, but a super bummer, though, was at a party, like a house party, a few weeks later, William lost his phone with this evidence on it. Like, what a kick in the teeth. Here you have this, like, evidence, and forget about, like, even like, oh, now the world will know. Simply just the people in your life.
There would be something tangible to point to, and you wouldn't have to just have people taking your word for it, which...
Yes. Well, like anything, I'm sure there's people in William's life that believed him. And I'm sure that there were those that maybe, especially like family members who said, oh, yeah, we believe you, but maybe personally didn't. This would have been, a way of dispelling any of those doubts. And so, yeah, I'm sure losing that phone, it's not just like the bummer of losing your phone, at the bar on a Friday night. I mean, it would be like finding a gold mine and then forgetting where the mine is.
Another thing about losing the phone, you probably already told people you had this evidence.
Oh, yeah.
And then suddenly, when they ask to see it, you've lost the phone. Sounds awfully convenient of an excuse to people.
Right. And so it's one thing to say this happened to me and people not believe you, but to say this happened and I have proof, but then suddenly, oh yeah, my girlfriend goes to another school.
Exactly.
Yeah, my girlfriend, oh, she's super hot. Yeah, she goes to another school though. It's kind of like that,
Right.
So people are like, okay, let's see this girlfriend. So in the summer of 2009, William welcomed two new housemates, a guy named Paul and a guy named Matt. Paul, he moved into the larger room, and Matt settled into the smaller one that overlooked the front of the house. And life at the house seemed to fall into a familiar rhythm. William, his brother Darren, would frequently stop by on Sunday afternoons to crash on the couch after, a few drinks out at the pub. These visits became somewhat routine and relaxed and uneventful, and for a while at least, which is kind of the case in a lot of haunting stories, it will come in seasons. And for a little while, the activity, there might have been the odd little thing every now and then, but for the most part, the activity kind of smoothed over, which, once again, like I said, this is something that's kind of, we see this a lot, and part of me wonders if it has to do with the season of life someone is in, whether it's good or bad. And if you're going through a more negative time in your life, these things might appear more because, like we said, if we go by the theory that these things feast on negative energy, well, in happier times, it might make sense why they might be a little more docile than they would be during more tumultuous time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Especially if you're in a negative headspace, you're probably going to attract more negativity.
Absolutely. I mean, so many of the cases we cover that have to do with hauntings, I mean, typically there's a marriage that's on the rocks, or there's a child that for whatever reason is having problems or something like that is then causing other, financial problems or whatever it is. A lot of times these stories will surround those sort of negative aspects of life. And, like I said, it makes sense. And it also makes sense, too, why people might think, oh, well, this was just a cash grab. This was just someone trying to cash in on a ghost story. Well, no, maybe the reason these things are happening is because they are in a negative time in their lives, and these things are plaguing them because it's essentially a buffet for them. So like I said, things were kind of docile, a little quiet for a while, which I'm sure was much needed, especially after the passing of Dan, and everything. It sounds like William really kind of deserved a time of peace, essentially. But then came one particular Sunday that shattered all of their calm. Shattered their vibes.
Killing the vibes.
Killing the vibes, you know what I mean? No cap! What began as a typical lazy Sunday quickly spiraled into another eerie chapter in the haunted history of House 333. Darren's visit that day would leave William and his housemates grappling once again with the unshakable sense that something, and not just something, but something sinister, was living among them. You see, that Sunday, after Darren's usual pub session, he joined William and Paul and Matt in the living room for, just a laid-back evening to watch some television, or some telly, as they might say over there.
A little telly.
The atmosphere started off as casual as you might expect, with everyone absorbed in the show, when suddenly Matt blurts out, "Pause it." So, of course, everyone's like, "What? Well, dude, what's going on?" They all look at Matt with a confused look on their face, right? Matt, however, was not looking at the television or at any of them. His eyes were fixed on the small gap beneath the living room door, which on the other side of this door would have been the hallway. The door was closed, of course. He's looking at that little strip, that little gap between the floor and the door, and they watch as a shadow moves across that little strip of light between the floor and the door, like someone just walked by. Something it makes me think of is that scene in No Country for Old Men where Josh Brolin waits at the motel and he sits at the edge of the bed and he's waiting for he sees the shadow walking by the door. He's waiting for Anton Chigurh. It's almost like that. Everyone's holding their breath and they're watching this shadow walk by the door. William says, "What is that?" And now I want to read for you the excerpt directly from our source here. This is from the book The Lady in the Bay Window by William C. Grave, and I'm just going to read this verbatim from the script. So, I really want to kind of put it in his words. "What's wrong?" I blurted out. I've just seen a shadow move slowly past the bottom of the door." Well, bearing in mind that my brother had previously lived in the house for 8 months, this was the first time he'd seen this happen. He was clearly concerned, and he nervously stroked his chin, exclaiming, "This shouldn't be happening." We all heard the clearest footsteps we'd ever witnessed. The TV was still paused, and there was no traffic noise from the outside. The footsteps sounded like a heavy-footed person with boots on, walking slowly away from us and up the staircase. The noise started to fade as the footsteps reached the landing at the top of the stairs, and the loose floorboards on the hallway at the top of the stairs creaked as the heavy-set figure made its way to the bathroom door. The tension was building as we saw, motionless, listening, not daring to breathe. We clearly heard the doorknob turn. Then the hinges of the door squeaked as it opened, and the footsteps began again as they made their way on the tiled floor. The door then slammed shut, and silence once again descended on the house as we all looked in astonishment. We started to laugh as we sought to break the tension. Our masculine bravado kicked in and we started to joke about it. "It looks like we're in for an interesting night," quipped Paul, but the laughter was a little forced and the looks on our faces betrayed our anxiety. "Someone's got to go have a look," said Matt, looking straight at me. "Me?" I asked, sounding a little more afraid than I wanted to. "Well, it's your house," Paul chipped in. "Yeah, go have a look," Darren agreed. "We'll be here if you need us." "Oh, great, marvelous. Thanks for that." They laughed as I crossed to the door and slowly pulled it open. As I made my way upstairs and onto the landing, I switched on every light along the way. I moved down the small upstairs hallway. I checked every room, opening the doors with a show of confidence that I didn't really feel, and there was no one there. As I returned to the top of the stairs and reached the creaky floorboard, I called out, "If there's anyone here, please don't jump out at me." I heard nervous laughter from downstairs. I had no doubt they wouldn't be laughing if it was one of them in my place. I approached the bathroom door slowly, and I took the doorknob in my hand. I turned it. It made the same intense noise we'd heard only minutes ago, and I pushed the door open, reached in, and pulled on the light switch. To my relief, there was nobody to be seen. I arrived back at the bottom of the stairs. My brother then asked me to try and replicate the shadow under the door by standing behind it and closing it. I walked by it slowly as he worryingly said, "That's it. That's exactly what I saw, but it was walking slower than you just did." I walked back in the front room, shrugging my shoulders in disbelief as I rejoined the lads on the sofa. Matt, Paul, and I were comfortable with what we had just witnessed, as this was a fairly regular occurrence, but my brother wasn't. He was even contemplating facing the wrath of going home rather than sleeping downstairs alone. We continued the evening watching TV, discussing casually what had just happened. As time passed, it seemed less and less real, and we could discuss it in an even more relaxed way. Then suddenly Darren shouted, "Pause it again." The heavy footsteps were back, pacing at the top of the stairs, backward and forwards along the hallway. This second time really got to Darren. "Stop this now," he shouted at the ceiling. "You're freaking me out." And the noise suddenly stopped. And that is where we're going to end Volume 1 of The Haunting of House 333. Boy, oh boy. Whew. Things are getting hot, man.
They are, and yet I've got chills.
And you notice, I'm using a few different sources, and, in William's book, he goes into a lot more detail just about, the personal things that were going on in their lives. Because you'll notice there in the excerpt I read, it said Darren almost was willing to go home and face the wrath at home. There was issues going on in his private life, that sort of thing, which in this excerpt it mentions it. But, for the sake of the story, I'm kind of keeping to the core, the nuts and bolts, the steak and potatoes of the tale. But horrifying. And finally now, Darren is experiencing something. Now, if I remember correctly, I don't think William has yet actually visually seen the woman yet. Well, he saw that hulking figure in the picture. That he saw. But I don't know, this old lady, I'm very curious to see what the tale is with that, this Mrs. Tompkins.
Either way, this is quite the eventful story. So many accounts in this house.
Well, I'll tell you what, Gage. I got a list of names I wouldn't mind finding standing in my bay window.
Oh yeah, who's that?
The names of our top-tier Patreon subscribers. Of course, the Dream James Watkins, the Finnish Face Via Lungfist, the Madman Marcus Hall, the Tenacious Teresa Hackworth, the Heartbreak Kid, Chris Hackworth, the Oh-So-Suave Sean Richardson, the British Bone Breaker, Bex Gray, the Notorious Nicholas Barker, the Terrifying Taylor Lashmet, the Count of Cool Cameron Corliss, the Archduke of Attitude Adam Archer, the Sinister Sam Kiker, the Nightmare of New Zealand Noeline Vivilli, the Loathsome Johnny Love, the Carnivorous Kevin Bogey, the Killer Stud Carl Staub, the Firestarter Heather Carter, the Conqueror Christopher Damian Damaris, the Awfully Awesome Annie, the Murderous Maggie Leach, the Serve Sexy Sam Hackworth, the Evil Elizabeth Riley, Lauren Hellfire Hernandez Lopez, the Maniacal Laura Maynard, the Vicious Karen Van Vieren, the Arch Nemesis Aaron Bird, the Sadistic Sergio Castillo, the Rapscallion Ryan Crum, the Beast Benjamin Huang, the Devilish Chris Doucette, the Psycho Sam, the Electric Emily Zhang, the Ghoulish Gert Hankum, the Renegade Corey Ramos, the Crazed Carlos, the Antagonist Andrew Park, the Monstrous Michaela Schur, the Witchy Wonder J.P. Weimer, the Freaky Ben Forsyth, the Barbaric Andrew Barry, the Mysterious Marcella, the Hellacious Cale Hoffman, and Pugblorb, the Poltergeist. Oh, oh, oh. Folks, thank you so much. Thank you, Gage, for everything. Thank you to all of our listeners. Of course, follow us on all of the social medias. Like, rate, subscribe, and of course, if you need a little more Creep Street in your life, head on over to patreon.com/Creep Street Podcast for all sorts of goodies. Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
And I'm Gage Hurley.
A good night and goodbye.